Hey, welcome to Brute Facts. I got a fun show tonight. I have the one and only Dyer, author, co-creator of the TV show, the Hollywood Decoded. Also pretty philosophically inclined, theologically inclined, and recently myself been looking at a lot of the things that he puts up on YouTube as far as philosophy goes and theology. So I'm excited for this one. Hang out. I appreciate everybody that's here, and we'll be on in a minute. Hello. How are you, Jay?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Pretty good. So why don't you give us a short introduction about you?
Yeah, I'm a guy who started doing media analysis, movie analysis, writing essays on geopolitics, film, philosophy, kind of throwing in my own weird brand of humor maybe about 12 years ago, and started as a blogger while I was doing my undergraduate and then graduate work. And then it kind of turned into its own thing. It just sort of snowballed. Did a couple books. We did one season of a TV show and expanded into doing debates on various topics, religious issues, Muslims, Roman Catholics, atheists. And then took over hosting the fourth hour of ALEXJONES in the last year. So that's pretty much what I do is just talk about all these crazy topics and just sort of throw in my own spin. And as you said, a lot of it does deal with comparative religion, theology, apologetics, but there's also other stuff too. So I do a lot of, movie stuff, like you said.
Yeah. So were you, so you're Eastern Orthodox. Were you raised as a Christian, or was there a time that you kind of became a Christian? How did that work?
I was raised Southern Baptist. We were nominal. We weren't really that serious about it. We would maybe go for kind of holidays or every few months. But I did kind of get a loose kind of biblical education growing up. So it did kind of imprint on me. I didn't really have much interest in religion at all throughout high school. I was kind of a wild party guy. I was the wittiest guy my senior year. So then at about age 18 or 19, I started reading the Bible. It started having an effect on me. I was still Protestant at the time. And then just kind of went on a really long rabbit hole journey of looking into different religions as well into my 30s and late 20s, early 30s. I didn't convert necessarily to other religions, but I looked at them. After many years of Roman Catholicism, I ended up leaving Protestantism for Catholicism in my 20s. And for most of my 20s, I was involved in that. And then started having a lot of doubts about the doctrine of the papacy and Vatican II in relationship to previous Roman Catholic teaching in the centuries prior to Vatican II. And just kind of got a little disenchanted, I guess you could say, for maybe 5 or 6 years. I wasn't atheist, but I kind of just had not much of a position except maybe loosely Platonic or Neoplatonic. I read a lot of perennialist works, perennialist philosophers. And then kind of in my early to mid 30s, I started gradually kind of getting back into Christianity, and eventually for me that ended up being Orthodoxy. But it took me about 10 years to finally convert to Orthodoxy. So it was a long kind of roundabout journey through, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 different positions that I held for a while, and then finally ended up Orthodox for the last several years.
Yeah, and so you were a Van Til guy at one time, weren't you?
Yeah, I went to Bonson Seminary when I was 21 or 2. I think I did a year there, and that was right when I was starting to question the Protestant ethos and its sort of underpinnings with sola scriptura. I got really deep into Bonson and Van Til. I read most of their printed works at that time, and was very convinced of the argumentation, the apologetic, and the logical approach to proving God's existence, and all that always appealed to me. But at the same time, I was trying to square it with a lot of the theology in the Calvinist world, which was, grounded in things like total depravity. And so I started thinking, well, how can the transcendental argument for God be the case if we're also arguing for, total depravity? And I would have email exchanges with a lot of the big apologists at that time that were still alive. Like John Frame and I had several email exchanges back and forth about that kind of an issue. And eventually I just kind of wandered out of Protestantism and into Rome at that time. So, but I never really gave up TAG, but I didn't really know what to do with TAG when I went into the Roman Catholic world and kind of immersed myself in Thomism. So I just kind of held off, and I thought, well, maybe there's some way to reconcile Thomism with TAG that I just don't know about. But that was in my early 20s. That did happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first actual debate I ever watched was Bonson, the great debate. And I didn't even know what apologetics was. And, I was just enthralled by, his style and the way that he, handedly won the debate. And the next thing I was presuppositionalist guy myself and didn't even know what
Okay, I didn't know you were into all that.
Yeah. I grew up Southern Baptist.
Oh, okay. So yeah, me too.
Very fundamentalist Southern Baptist, hyper literalism and inerrancy, all these, crazy things that our Southern Baptists like to hold on to. So I've kind of run the gauntlet like you. And on me, I actually got into the philosophy side, and the kind of theology and church history and things like that kind of was on the back burner. So I'm kind of late to the game, really learning, church history. And so I'm still kind of like, it's odd because I went from being a pre-sup to really liking Thomism to now looking at Eastern Orthodoxy. So
gotcha.
Kind of a similar ride, I guess.
Yeah, it is. But did you have an atheist agnostic phase?
Yeah, I went through a total deconstruction from fundamentalism, and it was we lived in a poor neighborhood and grew up on the street, so for many years I just didn't care about God. And when I really started to look into it, all these beliefs that I had and just took as true, just kind of tumbled around me, and I became agnostic for a short time. And that's what kind of fueled me into, like you, looking at world religions. I was convinced there was a God.
Yeah.
But I wanted to know who that God was.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's okay. I wasn't trying to call you out.
No. Yeah,
exactly of the trek that you had taken. But yeah, that's interesting. Very similar.
Yeah, no, I'm an open book. I'll talk about anything other than my wife. She's kind of mean. So. But so what was it about Thomism that started to kind of push you away from it?
Well, when I was Roman Catholic, I went from Calvinism straight into Roman Catholicism. I didn't have like an Anglican side road or anything like that, like a lot of people do. I just went straight into the Roman Catholic world. And then after about a year of the Novus Ordo, I went pretty hardcore into the Latin Mass community, SSPX. So I was a trad Catholic for most of that time in my 20s. And really, I think that Thomism was easy to accept coming from Calvinism, because I'd read, for example, Arvin Voss's book From Calvin to Aquinas, and that had an impact on me and showed kind of a lot of similarities that were there that I didn't think were there when I was a hardcore Calvinist. So that softened me up, and I think that just the Calvinist love and preference for systematization and that the elegance of that intellectual system structure was easy to accept. It was an easy move. But then when you're in the world of traditional Roman Catholicism and Thomism, you kind of think that it's just like the ultimate system and it's perfect, and it's not really ever going to be, you're not going to find problems. And then you're kind of struck when you find these theological and philosophical problems that you just assumed were solvable or just wouldn't even be there. So, problems like created grace, problems like monoenergism, problems like issues with Thomas's Christology, problems with absolute divine simplicity. All of those things eventually came on my radar when I started reading Orthodox critiques of Thomism, as well as the Eastern Fathers and their approach to Trinitarian theology and Christology. And for a long time, I thought, well, I'm sure I can reconcile these somehow. There's got to be. So I try to kind of I wasn't a uniate, but I try to think like, well, maybe there's a uniate answer to this. Eastern Catholics have maybe they have a unique way to approach Palimism and Thomism. And over time, the more I read a lot of the academic works on the issue of absolute divine simplicity in the modern debate, I just saw that there just wasn't really any way to make Palimism mix with Thomism. And so, those are the main problems, I think, that kind of plague Thomism. And then there's other issues that relate to epistemology that I tried to debate with Trent. But really at root, I think it's just two different conceptions of how we go about knowing God and what it means to participate in God. And the Thomistic system, I think, just fails on both accounts.
Yeah, and that was for me, Thomism was a little different because coming from the philosophy side of it, I, was already had dealt with, modal collapse, necessitarianism, and the whole Pope thing was, something I just couldn't really get on board with. And I think I was drawn to Aquinas because of the, it seems to try to strike a balance between, empiricism and rationalism. And, but honestly, I think it was the challenge of trying to understand Thomism that was what kept me, spending a lot of time there and being drawn to it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's funny because my wife is Italian and Roman Catholic, or the family grew up Roman Catholic. And, here I was a Southern Baptist trying to, you got to be baptized, you got to do this, you got, all this. Mm-hmm. And now I agree far more, with a lot of Catholic, at least the way, Catholics approach scripture and leave a lot of things open, for interpretation and things. And I lean far more in their camp than I ever would Southern Baptist anymore. Mm-hmm. So we've kind of come full circle, and
right.
She's just kind of sitting back going,
yeah. So, are you at a juncture where Protestantism is kind of up in the air for you, or have you moved towards Catholicism, or you're open to Orthodoxy, or where are you at really?
So this is the kind of the holding pattern that I'm in now. The last 6 months I've been doing really deep dives and study into Jewish theology and Jewish metaphysics in the early church, pre-Nicene. And to me, I just see there just seems to be so much there, at least on the Catholic side. Now, Eastern Orthodoxy, I have, Orthodoxy in general, I've looked at just briefly and didn't realize, how much difference there was. And honestly, it was a friend of ours that's in your server who was like on Discord. He's like, you need, because I was talking about all these philosophical issues that I had with Catholicism and these issues that I had with, Judaism not seeming to kind of line up with, the theology or the metaphysics of at least Catholic undergirding. And he, was like, you need to, check this, this, I'd heard about the essence and energy distinctions, and these things were kind of intriguing to me. And the more that, I watched a lot of your videos and, been in Discord server there and, listen to you guys talk about a lot of it. There seems to, at least my recent introduction to it, it seems as though the Eastern Orthodox is more true to the original Jewish theology than, what the Catholics are.
Yeah.
And that's something I find extremely compelling, because, I want to get to, the genuine original, Christianity, not kind of this watered down stuff that we have in the U.S. And, so yeah, it's been pretty interesting, and I'm still, I'm starting to read some Maximus the Confessor, and have actually the Orthodox Study Bible that you recommended. I got it on the way. I couldn't get the leather bound; that was a little bit expensive, but so
yeah, I think in the pre-Nicene theologians and church fathers, you do see elements that are kind of that anticipate the later theology of people like St. Maximus or the Cappadocians. If you look at St. Theophilus, for example, you see him clearly making the essence and distinction. If you read St. Irenaeus' Against Heresies, you see him making a distinction between God's will and God's generation. And so there's a difference between the generating of the sun and the creating of the world. And that's really just a version of the essence and distinction. And really those models or those approaches are not what you see when we get up into the Middle Ages in the West with Aquinas and his basically identification of nature and person and God, his identification of the attributes with the essence, and the dogmatization of that strict identity thesis view at the Fourth Lateran Council. So there is a difference there, and I think that that's really the key to what distinguishes the two views, because it's not the Western model of the Trinity that's accepted at the Second Ecumenical Council. It's the Cappadocian model. The Cappadocian model emphasizes the monarchy of the Father and thus the distinctions of the persons, rather than beginning with an abstraction of the unity of the essence. So there's one God because there's one Father. So we know God first and foremost as the person of the Father, and then by extension, his generated Son and the spirated Spirit. So that's a different model. It's a different approach, a different order of theology than pretty much the totality of the West from the time of the Middle Ages until even the Reformers pretty much default to that Augustinian view. And that's not even, it shouldn't be really that controversial unless you're just mired in Latin theology, because if you read Radagolwitz's PhD thesis on this topic, that's essentially what he says, is that it's just pretty obvious if you read the the Cappadocians and compared them to Augustine, that they have different Trinitarian views and models, and the ecumenical church did not approve the Augustinian model. It accepted the Cappadocian model. So you would think that Roman Catholics, for all their hailing of, the ecumenical councils, they apparently don't care much about the second ecumenical council, where you get that acceptance of the monarchy of the Father, and it's essentially a rejection of filioque as well, with the Father being the sole cause. All the Cappadocians stress that ecstatically, and so if the Father's the sole cause, then the Son can't also be the sole cause. Thus, it excludes the possibility of filioque. And you have to interpret the creed, the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, according to the Cappadocian teaching, which is what that council says. So that's typically the way that the Orthodox approach the councils. When I was Roman Catholic, I'd never heard that. I'd never thought about it that way. I didn't even think that there would be a difference between an Augustinian approach and a Cappadocian approach. But in terms of the state of the question in academia, it's not even that controversial. It's pretty clear that there's a difference of approach. And unless somebody's just mired in the Western view and has an agenda to try to say that there is no difference, it's just kind of absurd. If you read on the Trinity, it reads very different from Basil's on the Holy Spirit or something like that. And Augustine himself and on the Trinity says that he is unable to read the Greeks, so he admits his own sort of defect in that regard. So
yeah. Well, that's and then that's another intriguing aspect of it to me is the model of the Trinity in Eastern Orthodoxy. There seems to be, so what I liked about Catholicism was they seem to have this kind of robust philosophy and theology, that seem to cover so many bases. And the more that I learn about Eastern Orthodoxy, it's like, all these gaps there are in Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy has more robust and better explanations. Like when we talk about ontology with like moral realism, moral facts and things like this, I was drawn to, absolute divine simplicity, because we could just say it's identical to God, but it doesn't really, it just seems to kind of push the ball backwards a little bit. Yeah. And then we look at the energies and essences distinction, it seems to make a lot more sense that, these, we can have an ontology without having all the issues, that we have with divine simplicity, or the way a lot of modern apologists, want to try and ground moral facts and knowledge, abstracts, universals, and things like that. Mm-hmm, so it's that's definitely a part of it that I'm intrigued with. And one other part that I like is in Catholicism, there seems to be this almost like a divide between the common people and God. And, you don't have religious experiences, or things, not your common people, or, things like it may just be my experience, but, I feel like I've had genuine religious experiences before. And, the mysticism or whatever they, refer to it as, with the prayers and, things, the practices in Eastern Orthodoxy that it's like, they seem to be a lot more open to, these kind of personal religious experiences. Is that?
Well, I think that there have been times in the West when there was an overemphasis on scholasticism, which kind of led to a reaction in the Roman Catholic world into hyper mysticism and ecstatic, sensualistic experiences with a lot of the women saints, who describe their religious, mystical experiences in very, what we would say, delusional ways. Jesus, we don't think Jesus is not carving his name into your chest. He's not giving you a circumcision ring. He's not making the host float around the room and telling you that you're his boy, that you and he are BFF and boyfriend, girlfriend. We think all that's delusion. And that was actually something that, spending many years in the traditional Catholic world, I was always kind of bothered by a lot of that, being Protestant growing up. So I think it just struck me as bizarre. But I just always said, well, that's just my Protestant hangups. Maybe I just don't get it. Then what I noticed was that I would meet, a lot of people in the traditional Catholic world who knew all this Marian mystical gibberish and all these crazy stories and tales and all the legends of Saint whatever, but they didn't know anything about the scripture. They couldn't even tell you the 10 Commandments, but they knew all about all these Marian apparitions and legends. And I just felt like something's off here. This is not making sense. It just doesn't. It's not what this religion is supposed to be. I mean, if that's the essence of the religion is just all of these recent Marian apparitions, then what did the church of the first 1,000 years have? I mean, they were missing that. If that's the essence of the religion and what the focus of the religion should be, then it should have been there all along. It should have been there for the first 1,000 years of the church. And yet that's not what we see. So for me, what was really kind of the ultimate sort of determiner between East and West, what's the true church between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, was to really just dig more and more into the councils of the first 1,000 years and to see what is the canon law, what does the pronunciation of those canons say, what's their mindset. And if Vatican I, for example, doesn't line up with the canons of the first 7 councils, then Vatican I is an innovation. And that's eventually what I came to believe, is that clearly we have synodality, we have canonical privileges given to different patriarchates and sees. There is not this presence of Vatican I, infallible, universal jurisdiction, supremacy, the charism of, whatever. That's not there. And you can track the growth of it through the acceptance of these various papal forgeries over the many centuries. Ubi Petrus has a great video on that, the history of papal forgeries that contributed to the schism between the East and the West. And of course, nowadays, the Vatican has admitted, yeah, those are all forgeries. Yeah, sure, they contributed. So what? It's still true. I just don't think that any of that holds water. And I think these things go together. The lack of unified experience in the West for the saints, which is something very contrasted to the Orthodox Church. In other words, the Orthodox view of genuine mysticism is that all of the saints in the Orthodox Church have the same experience, whether it's Moses on Mount Sinai, or whether it's Paul, or whether it's St. Gregory Nazianzus or Basil or St. Gregory Palamas. Throughout those centuries and those millennia, the experience is one and the same. It's all the experience of the divine uncreated light, period. That's it. There's no I'm going to go the dark night of the soul where Jesus carves his name into my chest. I'm going to go experience the apparitions of blah, blah, blah. It's it's crazy. And that is an overreaction. That's histrionics reacting against the excessive scholasticism, which led from this rationalistic, logos obsessed approach to the extreme of a effeminate, histrionic emotionalism that is anti-rational. And so both of those extremes are wrong, and they're really replacements for the authentic Orthodox mystical experience, which is, again, the unified experience of the divine light. And that's why Paul talks about the divine light. That's why Paul talks about the essence energy distinction, that the energies of God are at work in him. That's the Greek word that he uses, the energeia of the Spirit at work in him in his epistles. And he's really, we would say, just speaking in line with what is the Mosaic experience on Mount Sinai of nobody can see God face to face, and yet Moses walked and talked with God face to face. How is that possible? Well, Jesus explains in John 5 to the Pharisees that Moses talked to him face to face. So Moses wasn't looking at the essence of God in this beatific vision, the Origenist view, as the Roman Catholic Church teaches. He wasn't directly seeing the Father. No man sees the Father at any time, Jesus says. The only answer after that is to say that Moses interacted with the personal energies of the Logos, of Christ himself, And so the essence-centered distinction, the triadic view of the Old Testament is exactly perfectly the model of the experience of Moses, which is the experience of Paul in the New Testament, which is the experience of all the saints. So Trinity, essence-centered distinction, uncreated grace, they all go together for us.
Yeah, that's, the like I was talking about there, there just seems to be much more robust explanation,
Well, and also I think it's more faithful to Revelation. I mean, the idea that, the essence-centered distinction isn't just cooked up from some philosophical speculation. We think it's faithful to the data of Revelation, that when Moses is interacting with the goodnesses of God, right, or his backsides, that's distinct from God who is in his inner being, his essence. That's God as revealed to us. And so that's how we can have a both and rather than an either or dialectical philosophy here of, well, it's either the essence of God or it's a creature. That's the Roman Catholic Latin extreme position, right? Where this is the strict either or. That's what Barlium says to Palamos in the debate with Acandino. So, we have a both and rather than either or. And that's, again, just faithful to the data of Revelation. It's faithful to, for us, it's fundamental to explaining the theophanies. If you have an absolute divine simplicity view, as we see on the Trinity, Augustine he's at pains to explain how there can be a theophany. And he says, I think they have to be angels. Well, no, fundamental to orthodoxy, they're not angels. Read St. Justin Martyr's debate with Trypho the Jew. He says these theophanies, that's Jesus. Who do you think it is, Trypho, if it's not Jesus in space and in time? And if it's not possible for one hypostasis to manifest in space and time, well, then you're not a Christian, because now you've implicitly denied the incarnation. You've denied that the second hypostasis of the Trinity stepped into time and space and entered into a mode of being, namely being incarnate, that the Father and the Holy Spirit didn't. So this is fundamental Orthodox theology, fundamental Trinitarian theology, and these other sects and these other groups are just all over the place because they're confused and they're wrong.
So how long did it take you to go from a traditional Protestant style worship to, or get used to the liturgical style of worship? Was that because and I know it's my, Protestant upbringing, and not only that, the anti-Catholic, anti-Orthodox kind of positions that they held. It seems so foreign to me. The liturgical style of worship, and I understand, the history behind it and the practice and all that. It's, not just the liturgical style, but I think the closest church that we have Orthodox is Antiochian or Antiochian. And I was doing a lot of reading up on them, and they were like touching the priest's robes for prayers or something, as you walk through with the incense or something like that. And it just, with my background, it would just seem kind of odd.
Well, we just read that in the liturgy, the reading in Luke, where the woman with an issue of blood reaches out to grab the hem of his garment, and Jesus says, I perceive that power, dunamis, energeia, the essence of distinction, went out from me. And of course, Jesus it's not that he lacks knowledge. He knew who it was, but he wanted to call attention to that act of faith on the part of the woman to teach his disciples something. And so the purpose in the liturgy, when people reach out to touch the vestment of the priest, is a reminder of that instance in the Gospels, because we see that we believe the priest is an icon of Jesus. And so he really is operating not in his own person in the sense of his sins. We're not Donatists, so we don't think that the sins of a minister affects the grace of the sacraments per se. We think that Christ is still present even in those actions, even if we're all sinners, right? So in the liturgy, the priest says, even though I'm a sinner, he prays that prayer in the liturgy too. But to answer the question about how I went from that, I was in a weird turn of events as a Reformed Protestant, pretty strict Calvinist. We held to the Westminster Confession pretty strictly. we had, ironically, a couple kind of disputes in my local church and my little Presbyterian denomination, which was really strict, over some things, which in a roundabout way kind of led me into liturgical worship. So, for example, we had some debates amongst our little denomination about whether we should have instruments or whether it should be solo psalmody, or whether, there should be head coverings. These kinds of things would come up for women. And so I started realizing that, well, as a sola scriptura adherent, it's very interesting that I believe in the regulative principle of worship. And for those that don't know, if you're in Calvinist circles, the hardcore strict Calvinists believe in what's called the regulative principle, which is that you can't do anything in worship that isn't explicitly mentioned. And that sounds good maybe on paper, but the problem is that when you go to Calvinist churches and Protestant churches and you see this enacted in practice, there's really not a clear New Testament pattern of worship. I mean, Paul talks about the pattern of worship, but he doesn't lay out how the service is. And that's why you get all of these sort of disputes over the history of, Protestant worship. What's allowed? Can we have an organ? Can we not? Do we only sing the Psalms? And so in a roundabout way, I started thinking, well, maybe I should look to the early church, because if the apostles went out and set up these churches, then maybe they kind of laid out a generic pattern of worship or a rough pattern of liturgy, so to speak, right? And one of the first questions that came up, which also became a dispute between our denomination and some people that went into the Episcopal Church, or the Reformed Episcopal Church, was what about infant communion? And from my perspective, well, there wasn't really explicit texts that said yes or no. So what do we do on this issue? And it was this big debate amongst people in the denomination. And so there was all these books and essays, and I pulled out one of them because it reminded me of this. And Lightheart, who was for a while a hardcore Reform guy, I think he's now kind of in some loose Anglican quasi-Orthodox position. So Lightheart wrote this book, Daddy, Why Was I Excommunicated? Back in the day. So I read that many, many years ago, and that kind of got me thinking, wow, so he's actually arguing there's an interesting case for paedo communion. And of course, no Presbyterian church does paedo communion.
Right.
So I was thinking, well, maybe there's something to it. So then I did get a hold of some Anglican commentaries on liturgy. I visited Anglican church a couple of times. I had no interest in Anglicanism, but I read some of their books, and I thought, well, I guess I'm going to have to get into bigger issues, that it's not really ultimately about what is the perfect early church form of worship. So I realized I wasn't going to be able to settle this issue with the regulative principle of worship. I was going to have to look at bigger issues like the formation of the canon of Scripture itself, because I started realizing that kind of a more fundamental question was the canon of Scripture. So then I read, 5 or 6 books from Protestant, Anglican, Evangelical, Reformed, Jesuit scholars on how the canon came to be. And what I noticed across that whole spectrum was what everybody seems to agree on is that tradition has a key role in the formation of the canon. So then I was going to have to figure out, well, what exactly is that role? Is it equal to Scripture? Is it above Scripture? Is it under Scripture? Is there some relationship I don't understand? And that led me to, back in about 2001, I got the Church Fathers set. And I started diving into that. I'm going to have to read these Church Fathers. I was taking classes at Bonson Seminary from a guy named Chris Strevel, who's still a Presbyterian minister, by the way. And he said, all right, well, for class, you're going to get this stack of church books on ancient church fathers and medieval theology and philosophy. So I started diving into those. And I read the whole Pelican set, and I read the Cyril Richardson, and I read these different Anglican scholars. I think we use several Anglican scholars in that as well. And I started realizing, man, there's some stuff in these church fathers that I just didn't expect to be there. I didn't expect baptismal regeneration. I didn't expect the real presence. I didn't expect paedo communion. I didn't expect, these other so-called Catholic ideas to be there. And lo and behold, they are. And then I thought, well, now I'm going to have to expand into trying to figure out what is the early church's pattern of liturgical worship. And I noticed in Irenaeus and in Justin Martyr and in many of these pre-Nicene fathers that they do talk about the liturgy. They do talk about a pattern of worship. And then when you get into the history of liturgy and the history of worship, it's not really even that controversial that the early church in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century had basically adopted universally a combination of the synagogue and temple services put into a rough pattern of worship. And I realized, well, this isn't actually explicitly listed in Scripture. I was already doubting sola scriptura. And then it just finally hit me that, well, there is a regulated principle of worship, but it's at the behest of the living church and the successors to the apostles who govern that church. And they're the ones who have the authority and the right to interpret and make these decisions. I'm not going to find some document somewhere that has the perfect worship service, because when I started reading the ancient liturgies, whether it's the liturgy of St. Basil or the liturgy of St. Mark, the liturgy of St. James, which are, again, go back very early, 2nd, 3rd century. And in some cases, the liturgy of St. Mark, I think, is one of the oldest in Alexandria. And I noticed, man, this is just all straight up liturgical worship. It's all antiphonal. It's borrowed from, you can clearly see, the synagogue temple services that we know of in the ancient world. And then, I got a hold of great books like the Antiochian Orthodox Church put out this book, Orthodox Worship, Living Continuity with the Synagogue and the Temple by Williams and Anstal. There's another good one on this by Hugh Wybrew, which is the Orthodox Liturgy. And so the more that I got into the Old, and then studying the Old Testament as well, and the question of continuity between the Old and New Testament, which was a big issue for Calvinists. I was super into covenant theology. So I think, ironically, in a roundabout way, I was, as a Calvinist, actually in ways prepared. And I was actually in the Rushdoony Reconstructionist camp. So I was really, I'd read a lot of Rushdoony. I read his Institutes. And so he had such a positive view of the Old Testament, and not just the penal sanctions, but even the ceremonial laws and the principles behind the ceremonial laws, that really that was just a huge warm up for me, even though I didn't know it at the time, to understanding the parallels between Old Testament temple and synagogue worship, and the Orthodox Church is really the fulfillment of that. And so if you watch that documentary that our friend Lewis made, which is the Old Testament, New Testament worship in the Orthodox Church, I think that's like a perfect expression of what I came to. But it took me a long time to get there.
Yeah, that so to me, it just, for years now, I haven't held to sola scriptura for years. But I had a conversation with, it was a Catholic, and we were talking about, proper interpretation, and how do you get a proper interpretation, without some kind of tradition or some type of authority, and the more I thought about it, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, how could sola scriptura be true when we're still interpreting it through man? So yeah, that, and something about the liturgical style of worship. I've been to Catholic church a few times, and there's something about it that just, it seemed more proper. It seemed more reverent. In a lot of ways.
How did Jesus worship? Well, he worshipped at his local synagogue and temple in a liturgical way. Yeah. Absolutely.
And that's what I was, having those already, the more that I've learned about Judaism and the practices of their temple worship, how meticulous they were, how, they had, they went through these, in order. They had, everything was very structured.
Yes.
And it wasn't this, go in there and get a good message and a good feeling and, being manipulated by worship music and, things like that.
Exactly. And I had a good, time period experiencing, the Reformed world, coming out of the Baptist world, and then going into the Roman Catholic world in the sense of the Latin Mass for many years. So, it kind of went from like one, I wasn't really into charismatic stuff. I guess that would be the extreme of the opposite of the Latin Mass, but But I did go to some Novus Ordo masses that were basically like charismatic Protestant churches, and I'd visited a few charismatic services back when I was like 18 with some of my friends and stuff. But there's another book too that just reminded me of when I was a Catholic, and actually this book would actually benefit Orthodox too, because even though it's written by a Catholic, it's a well-known book by Father Meager, and he actually gives all these fascinating insights into how Christ said the first Mass. And so for us as Orthodox, we wouldn't have a problem with this either, because we would agree that, the Latin Mass, in terms of the Western rite of the Orthodox, is the Petrine rite, the Petrine Mass. So there's nothing wrong with it inherently. So I'm not advocating Roman Catholicism, but that was another book too that I remember that helped me along the way when I was kind of new to Catholicism out of Protestantism, how there's all this stuff that I just didn't know about, the history of the connections between what Jesus is doing in the upper room when he's instituting the Lord's Supper. A lot of that is coming out of the Old Testament, and he's playing on a lot of those even traditions that were part of the Passover ceremony. And so he's instituting his new Passover. And, for so long as a Calvinist, I viewed it like, well, that means he's fulfilled all those things. And so anything that you try to continue on in the New Testament would be Judaizing or would be a heresy. But then I started noticing, well, in the early church, that would mean that they're all heretics. And so like here I am trying to say that, Saint Athanasius is a great defender of the faith. And yet, he's got all these traditions about, he writes festal letters for Easter. He talks about the lives of the saints. He talks about liturgical worship, the real presence. I just realized that I myself was cut off from the people that I thought I was a champion of, and that I didn't believe anything like what they believed.
Oh, wow. So are you a full 5.2 Calvinist?
Yeah, I was like hardcore Bonson, Van Til, like I said, Reconstructionist. So you can't be a Reconstructionist if you aren't like a full Calvinist.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Reconstruction. I've heard the term.
That was a movement kind of out of the Bonson. Well, Bonson was part of it, but then there was R.J. Rushdoony, Gary North, and they kind of spawned this idea of Christianity that's post-millennial, that's 5-point Calvinist, that's they believe in applying Christian principles to the civil state. So you had to have a positively Christian civil state. What else? Dominion mandate. So it's the duty to not just go to church, but to take over the institutions for Christianity. Anyway, that's you had to be a Van Tillian. Those are the basic principles of Christian Reconstructionism.
Yeah, it's crazy because, talking about all of the Reformed, the person who really got me interested in philosophy itself was actually R.C. Sproul. And he used to have, this, like his lecture series, the lecture series that he gave.
I used to listen to his lectures too. Even when I was hardcore into Bonson event, I still like Sproul, and I would listen to, Sproul giving his Bible talks. I didn't really care for Sproul. I like his Bible talks better than his philosophy talks, but I never really got the whole Gerstner Sproul philosophy approach. I always agreed with Bonson and Van Til over those guys.
Yeah. The first time I ever heard the word ontology and ontological argument, and I was like, what is that? I gotta, so then I just kind of fried my brain trying to figure it all out, kind of jumping in midship.
Did you go to study philosophy? Is that what you studied?
No, I am 100% layman. I like I said, growing up in kind of a rough, poor neighborhood, we really didn't have, the opportunity to go to college. And, but I did end up, going to a trade school, learning a trade, and,
well, you're philosophy. Probably better off. College and university is overrated. So it's brainwashing centers basically. So
yeah, it's, I've been blessed. I made out pretty well, after, making pretty good money, but, philosophy became like a passion and a hobby. And I just, for about 12 years, just been, totally immersed in it. And started realizing, wait a minute, I am a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, a few years back, it was, I don't know anything about church history. I don't know about, all the different, I mean, I had a decent theology, but as far as orthodoxy goes, I was totally ignorant, didn't know anything about any of the church fathers, any of the, the apostolic,
Mm-hmm.
procession or and I bought a book like at one of those thrift online things years ago of the writings of the early church fathers, Polycarp and all it, and started reading them and was really surprised at how much I could follow what they talked about, and how there are a lot of similarities today, even in some Protestantism, to some of the ideas that they had. But I had no idea what can of worms I was opening when I got into it. So it's been a journey for sure. That's so. How did it? Was it your study of religion? Did you have like a love for film or the arts and the study of religion that kind of meshed to, culminate in, esoteric Hollywood?
Not really. I mean, they were two separate things that happened at different times. I mean, when I was in high school, I loved, we were all movie buffs. I was kind of in the artsy crowd of people. I like theater. I wanted to be an actor. I am heterosexual, by the way. Except when you talk about being in theater and all it. So, but yeah, so I wanted to do that. And then the more that I tried to pursue that stuff when I was 17, 18, I was pretty serious about it. I was preparing to try to go to different art schools and whatnot. And that's the career path I chose and I wanted to go down. But I wasn't happy at the same time. And at the time I had no religious interest at all. And, that kind of piqued my interest in religion at the time when I was 18. And so I started reading the Bible. I started going to various Bible studies, got invited to a lot of Protestant things. And, then I started going down a different path and I started reading books about comparative religion and different philosophies and history. And my mom was an editor and a librarian. So I was always raised with, books everywhere, books. And so I was predisposed to read, and I love to read about all these different topics. And prior to that, my reading was typically like fantasy sci-fi stuff. So in high school, I would read, but it was never anything serious. It was always, Terry Brooks and Tolkien and, fantasy sci-fi stuff. And then everything changed when I was about 18, when I started reading the Bible. And I thought, well, I find other things interesting now. I kind of grew up out of that stuff. And it's weird now because so many dudes are like all into comic book stuff. And it's just like, you're supposed to grow out of that, dude. You're supposed to become an adult and like get into, real stuff, adult things. And yeah, so it was two different interests and I never really expected or thought they would collide. But then when I was doing my undergraduate work, I would pick these classes when you get electives that I thought were interesting. And I was like, well, I always like movies and they're having some film classes. So I would just take film classes as electives for fun. And I was doing a philosophy and history degree. And then they didn't have at my school a strict philosophy master's. So you had to choose a dual master's program of English and philosophy, which was actually interesting because I got to combine a lot of lit and a lot of film classes and a lot of philosophy classes together. So it was this weird mix of things that, although I don't like the university system, I did enjoy a lot of the classes. And so it was just two different worlds that kind of ended up colliding. And when I got into grad school and was doing master's work in English and philosophy. I was at that time also expanding into reading a lot of geopolitical stuff, getting into a lot of espionage history and that kind of stuff. And so it's just like, well, there's a lot of movies that deal with this, and there's a lot of books about this, and then I'm writing papers about this, and then it just over time it just all kind of collided. And I read a bunch of books on the history of Hollywood and intelligence agencies, the CIA's relation to Hollywood, and then I read we had a couple classes on film and lit and Oliver Stone. I took a class on Oliver Stone's films, and that professor was quasi conspiracy minded. So we actually went through all these Oliver Stone films and compared them to the best accounts we have of historical events. And that was when I was thinking, man, this is, nobody ever talks about the relationship between Hollywood and the CIA. That's like, but then I found out when grad school, actually there is a little bit of a academic interest in this topic. So there's a handful of academics that write about this out there, like Trisha Jenkins and the Operation Hollywood book. So I just started getting into that, and I was like, I want to learn more about this. It's just fascinating. Just another domain of something that's interesting. So it just kind of in a roundabout accidental way came together. And I was going to do my master's thesis on Ian Fleming and James Bond as propaganda, and ended up having a falling out in the middle of writing the thesis with the graduate advisor, who was this super Green Party liberal dude. And then I just took the essay and published it in a peer-reviewed journal as it is. So that's actually the introduction to the master's paper that was never written. And then I was just like, man, I'm sick of, I've been off and on in academia for all these years, and I'm just tired of it. And then I just suddenly got the impetus, like, I want to be my own boss. I'm going to go strike out, do it my way, screw this stupid university system. That was the best decision I ever made, because I'm way better off now for having done it. I think that's the old model of doing things, the university way that's going away. It's the dinosaur model. So yeah, everything just kind of happened on its own. I don't know. It was crazy.
So it seemed like the books did pretty decent. There's a lot of positive reviews. I mean, not that I expect anything else, but
well, there's a few haters, and what's funny is that if you read the hater reviews, you can tell they didn't read it, because they always say this was a crazy conspiracy theorist who talks about reptiles and QAnon, and I'm like, there's nothing in my books about reptiles and QAnon, so clearly you didn't read this book. But yeah, I think it did okay. I mean, it wasn't a New York Times bestseller, but I didn't expect it to be. It did sell more and do better than I did expect. But the great thing about the book was that it was fun to do, and I like the books, but they really just kind of opened up more doors to do other things. And so the most fun I had wasn't the book, it was doing the TV show. I just loved, I always wanted to do that kind of work, work in media, work in TV. And then it just ended up happening. And I never would have thought I would be doing that, especially, 5 years ago when I was still doing grad work and miserable. I was like, I would never dream that it would get to that stage. So yeah, it was great to see it come about and come to fruition. I wish that we had done another season, but it is what it is. I'm happy for what they did make, but I look back and I'm like, man, I was fat back then, dude. Like, I was like, man, I wish I'd been trimmer and slimmer for, the season of a TV show, which will forever be, me as this kind of chunky dude. But yeah, I mean, it was a lot of fun, and the TV show turned out better actually than I expected it to be. That was the most fun. And then I'm having a blast now, just doing the fourth hour of Alex and, doing what I do now. So it's really just, it's almost surreal to be able to basically just turn on a computer and talk about whatever you're interested in. And then that's how you make a living. It's just weird, dude. I never would have dreamt of it being this way. And then at the same time, like, the world is dystopian and collapsing, but yet it's just so weird. Like, it's like a weird bittersweet mix of I get to do what I want to do for my dream job, but at the same time, the world's collapsing. So I don't know. It's just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, you got a heck of a following on YouTube, so it's kind of like, that's like new TV now. I mean, who actually watches TV anymore? So, it's, you know, I mean, everybody's going to, you know, podcasts and YouTube. And, I mean, look at Joe Rogan, look at, you know, a lot of these successful podcasters. And
yeah, I think those guys all paved the way for the way it, you know, is working now. And you know, unfortunately, that's why they're trying to shut everything down and censor everything. But
yeah,
I think, you know, we'll just keep plugging forward, and hopefully we can continue to. I mean, I'm happy to have done it for as long as I have done it. So if it all goes away tomorrow, I mean, I would be like, well, at least I got to experience, you know, 5 years of being my own boss as a, you know,
yeah,
YouTube podcaster or whatever you call this.
So I promised you an hour. We're at an hour. Do you have anything that you wanted to plug or anything? All of your links I've got in the description for your website, YouTube, and Twitter. Is there anything you have coming up or anything special, you know?
No, just the same. You know, we'll keep plugging away at the content that we are doing. We're going to be doing Decent in December, where we focus on Christian themed movies, positive movies, wholesome movies. We talk so much about dark, you know, degenerate films that it's high time that we talk about wholesome things, especially as we get nearer to the, you know, this era of the liturgical cycle, you know, in terms of nativity. So we'll be analyzing some good old movies and some good Christian films with positive themes for the Hollywood podcast. I just hosted the 4th hour of Alex today, so everybody can go over to freeworldnews.tv and watch the final hour breakdown that I did of the silent wars for whatever the document is. I just went blank on the document. This document that I have in front of me, silent wars for quiet, whatever it is. I've been talking all day, so my mind is mush. But I did that today. I plugged that, and then that's all I can think of for right now. But anyway, thanks for having me on. It was a great chat.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I really appreciate you coming on, man. There's so much information. I'm gonna have to go back and watch it again. It's I appreciate the book recommendations. I'm definitely gonna have to go back and take those titles down.
Yeah, you'll like those, and I hope you enjoy the Discord, and you know we got a good community in there, and we'll keep plugging away at that as well. I'm behind on that, so we should have another open forum and voice chat pretty soon in Discord. We haven't done that in about a week.
Right. Yeah, no, I've learned so much since I've been there. So
cool.
But other than that, man, I appreciate it. Thank you, boss.
Absolutely.
I'll let you have the rest of your night back.
All right. Thanks, man. You have a good night.
Oh, you too. Dyer. So that was pretty cool. Oh man, that was a lot to take in. Dude's super smart. I've been watching a lot of his stuff on Eastern Orthodoxy and finding, you know, Eastern Orthodoxy more and more compelling by the day. But so this is going to be the last show for the rest of this year, whatever's left of it. I am working on starting off the new year. I'm going to try to be more, how do you say it? Content that's, I'm lost for words right now. I just totally went blank. Thanks, Jay. It's your fault. Your blankness rubbed off on me. More informative content. Not that, you know, learning about all the guests it's been on. I had totally stoked at how many guests came on this year, the caliber of guests, and everyone, you know, who's subscribed this year, all the downloads that we have on the podcast, all of you out there that are downloading the podcast, thank you so much. I think we're over, I think it's about 2,200 downloads, and it's averaging about 89 every 7 days. So that puts it in the top 25% of podcasters, and I'm just like blown away. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you like the content. I will be doing more interviews next year also, with, you know, as big a names as I can get on here, but I do want to produce more informative content, such as being a layperson myself and being in philosophy as long as I have. I want to do a series on explaining philosophical terms and eventually getting into philosophical ideas and things in as much of a layman way that I can. So got that coming up, and hopefully it'll be successful. Hopefully people will like it. They're going to be short videos because I have a really short attention span, and so I tend to think that everybody else does too. Plus, who wants to watch 10-15 minute long videos explaining something? Anyway, thank you everybody for hanging out, being in the chat. The chat was lively. I am so thankful for everybody that was here, and we'll see you next time.